In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Skydomes inside of Unreal Engine 4. So the goal of this is to teach you the basic concepts behind Skydomes, how to fill your world, and how to build certain elements in here that you find kind of interesting, where you've got things like clouds that kind of move and are on their own kind of different plane, that we can create a custom texture for the sky that will serve as something like a sun. And then also this type of ripple effect that you kind of see on the clouds here as they roll through, so they don't feel like they're just kind of like these static images. So we just want to try to add a little bit of life to everything. There's also some atmospheric fog in here that we have, and we also have some other fog that will make it to where it feels as if we've got this fog at the horizon line. So let's go ahead and look at the different pieces that we're going to need to create to get all this work done. So if you've created a default project with Unreal Engine 4, you're probably seeing something that looks pretty similar to this, and it's got this default Skydome that's in here, and it's actually a blueprint, and it's pretty complex. It takes a look at whatever the directional light that you have inside of the world, and it actually updates the position of the sun based off of that. There's a lot of other controls in there for things like the clouds and things like that. So if we're able to take this actual directional light, select it, you hit the space bar, and you can actually move this thing to change your direction of that light. This won't actually update unless you select the actual blueprint for this, and there's this little button that you click to refresh the material on there. And you can see the lighting on this changed quite dramatically based off of the angle of this light. So this is assuming that it's getting very close to the end of the day, and they've made a lot of really cool controls on there for making this change of time of day. So if we put this more almost like a 12 o'clock noon and then click the background here and then say refresh material, you can see it's going to change quite a bit. Now if we do something like we push this to where the light direction is facing right here like this, we can click this and you can see that it's nighttime and we start to see stars. So we'll take a look at their setup that they have. This is a extremely complex setup that they have here, but there are some things that we're going to steal from that. I definitely want to take the whole sun direction updating. I want to take that from this thing and use that. But let's select this Skysphere Blueprint and let's start to take a look at it. So anytime we select something in the world, you can hit Control B and it'll actually select it in the content browser, so it makes it pretty easy for you to find that thing. Double click it and we'll load this thing up and take a look at the different pieces for this. So we've got a lot going on in this construction script that they've got here, this update sun direction, which we'll take a look at, and this viewport. If we click that, you can actually see the different pieces that they have here. And so what I want to get you to is that they have a mesh for this Skydome, and we're going to learn something about that. You can see we've got this static mesh here, and then they also have their material plugged into that mesh, and it's a pretty complex material. Let's take a look at the mesh real quick. So if we want to find that in the content browser, we can just click this little eye icon here, this magnifying glass, and it'll select it in the content browser. And I'm going to click and drag that thing over here just a little bit, and we should be selected now. Here's our SM Skysphere. Let's double click at that and load that up. Now this is us being able to see the static mesh for this. It has a material in here, but if we turn on the wireframe, you can see that it's basically we're inside of a really large sphere. Okay, and I'm going to show you in Maya how you could basically create your own version of that thing. So let's go ahead and load up Maya, and I've got a scene here that's already set up. I'll just tap 5 to just go into shaded mode, and I'll select the actual geometry and zoom out a little bit here. So you can see we've got a sphere. I've taken the the display of this, there's shading, and I can turn on this back face culling, and I can turn that on and off. If I do that, it only shows one side of the model. Now the reason it's only showing the inside of that is because the model has its normals facing inward on this thing. So we can go under mesh display and go to our normals, and we could reverse that if we wanted. But I'm looking for this functionality where we can take a camera, and even if we're very far on the outside of that sphere, we can always see on the inside of it. And if we move inside the sphere, it starts to look as if we're looking around inside of that kind of world. I'll tap 6 to turn on textures, and so you can get a better idea of what I'm kind of talking about here with this camera. So I'll zoom out. Another thing that I noticed about their setup is that they basically have all their texture, and it's only mapped to the top part of this sphere, and then the bottom part of the sphere is just a mirror of that thing. So what I did, I created a sphere, chopped it in half, and then just took the UVs for that, and then basically duplicated that. So when you start off with a sphere inside of Maya, it gives you a set of UVs that is cylindrical. They're like cylindrical mapping. So if I go here to UV and go to the UV editor, you can kind of maybe start to understand a little bit about what's going on here. If I move inside this a little bit, you can see we've got these thicker kind of green lines, and these are split lines. So imagine we had an orange, and we cut the orange in half, like you can see through this big thick line here, and we just got rid of the bottom half of it, and then we split down that orange again in one area, and we peeled off the peel of the orange, and then we laid it out flat. That's kind of what you're seeing here in the UV window. It's this top portion of the UVs, and it's been spliced open and flayed open to be kind of flat. And so when we put a texture on there, it is going to map to that entire area that we kind of see here. So it might be a little bit hard for you to understand if you don't know a lot about 3D models and UVs and things like that. Another thing that you can kind of think about is clothing. So if you think about all your clothing, if you took the clothing apart at all the stitch points on your clothes and you laid it out flat, you could actually take your three-dimensional clothing and you could lay it out flat on a table. That's kind of the same thing that's going on with the UVs. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding of maybe what's going on with the textures and why they map to this thing the way that they do. And so once it's created for the top half, all you have to do is kind of mirror that same thing for the bottom, and then that way you can get a texture that is pretty high res up here, and it'll actually show down here as well. We're going to look at some ways that they kind of hide the fact that they're doing this mirroring thing with this sphere like that. We'll look at that inside of Unreal Engine. The other thing I did, I give it a secondary UV set that's just a mapping from the top of this. So if you wanted to do anything special, like take a texture and have it like clouds roll from this side of the world over the top and come around here, you could do that with a secondary UV set. But we won't really be doing too much with that. But it's just something to keep in mind, that if you have that secondary UV set, you can actually do a little bit more with this this model that you have here. The other thing that we're going to be taking a look at is a ring of clouds. So I'm going to show this piece of geometry here and hide this larger dome structure, and it's kind of similar to the dome, except it has this top part chopped off and the bottom part, and so it's just this kind of part of a sphere here, and then the UVs on this are actually just wrapping around this whole thing right here. So if we take an image, it's going to map it going across this thing here, and when we get a section later, we're going to build clouds on here, get transparency, and then have the clouds move in a circular motion around this thing, and then build up different layers of these to give this illusion that we've got multiple depths of clouds. So let's start off very simple and then start building up our complexity as we learn a little bit more about Skydomes. So I've taken the Epic Blueprint and I've hidden the icon here, and I've also gone to the rendering section and then said actor hidden in game. So then it feels as if we have nothing in the sky right now. And I've taken those meshes that we looked at inside of Maya and exported them out as FBXs. And when I imported them in, they didn't have any textures or materials on them. I actually built those. I'll double click on the Skydome that I brought in, and you can see that once a material is made for this thing, I'll click and drag this thing out so we can see everything here. It's going to be pretty easy to take this mesh and then plug in a material for it right here in this area. So you can see I've made a folder structure for my materials, and I can actually just click any one of these and then click the little arrow, and it'll actually assign that material to it. So then that way, anytime I drag a new copy of that into the world for the mesh, it'll actually have a material already assigned to it. So that's how you can assign a material to something. I've already drugged this out in the world. It's pretty simple. Just click and drag it out into the world just like you see there. And it's going to place it there. I'm going to turn this thing on real quick. And this is the one that I have here. I'm going to turn on the visibility eye icon for this. And once it's placed into the world, I can actually select the thing and go up here. Here's also where we can tell it this is the static mesh for this thing. And you could even replace that with a different mesh if you wanted. And here's the material. So you have the opportunity to change the material in here after it's drug into the world as well. The size of this thing, I scaled it up pretty large, and I've actually raised it up on the Z axis, which is moving up, 2,000 units. So that's trying to get my horizon line whenever I look off this edge here. That middle part of that sphere is going to be right around in here like this. So we can actually look at the wireframe for this, and you can actually see kind of what's going on. So here's like that middle part of the sphere, and as we look up into the world, this is the size that we have for this thing here. So I'm just going to put this back on lit like we see here, and again I can actually select that thing, and depending on the size, the scale that I give this thing, it's going to have a different feel about it. I do have this locked to where it changes the scale uniformly for all the different axes as I change this. So as I make it larger, it kind of pushes, and it feels like those clouds go out maybe a bit more. It kind of lessens as it gets really, really large, that effect, but it does have an effect as you move from maybe something like 1, I'll go 0.5, and you can see it's starting to cut into the plane that we have here, so that illusion really gets kind of lost. So you definitely want this to be fairly large, so your world would actually fit within inside of that. If I select this and then tap F, you can see this is kind of the size of the world inside of here. So it's definitely very large. So I'm going to tap 1 to get back to this camera view that we see here. And so that's basically how the geometry was set up. Let's take a look at the material for this. So I've got a bunch of different materials that we can take a look at, but this is the one that is the most simple. So I'll just double click this and load this thing up here. One thing that's kind of cool about the material editor is you can actually, instead of looking at this cylinder or a sphere or a plane or a cube, you can actually replace the model that's used in here with an actual model that you're working on. So I can take the Skydome model and I can plug it into this little teapot area that we see here, and you can see now I can actually start to see this material applied as if I'm looking at it on that actual piece of geometry for the Skydome. So I can click and drag around and kind of get an idea of how this thing is working. So this one's pretty simple. For the material type, I can click on here and I set it to unlit. That means any kind of lights in the scene has no effect on this thing whatsoever. You don't want the lights to have an effect on your Skydome. You just want it to be whatever that pure color that's coming from the texture, that's what you want it to come from on here. So there's different ways that we can actually get a texture inside of here that you see for this setup. So we can take a texture like this, click and drag it over, and we can actually have it in here, and we could actually just take the out of this. This white represents red, green, and blue, and then this white down here represents alpha. You can see this is a kind of a brighter white through here, so that just means all three of these channels are combined into this, and we can feed this out to the emissive color like this. So here's currently what we would have if we just put the texture in here like this, right? you can see that that texture is being stretched all around this dome like this, and it's not very convincing. We need it to repeat more times going around here than we do have it repeating up. So that's what this texture coordinate thing is. So for any of these nodes, you can see that we can right click on here and start typing in the name of this thing. So if we do texture and then do coordinate, we can grab that node right through there. And if we plug this into the UV area, this is going to give us this control to start tiling around in the U direction, which is going around this way, or V, which is going to go up. So I know if I put this on 2, we're starting to see the clouds repeat a little bit more. And we can click and drag this thing up. You do want to use numbers like 2, 4, we could do 3 as well, but you want to use these whole numbers like this. So now I've got it tiling 4 times around. So depending on what the look is that you're kind of going for, you know, I could put that back down to 3 if I wanted to have the clouds spread out a bit more, like this. And the next part of this, you can see if I plug this in here, we've got some actual movement to the clouds. It's pretty slow, but what's going on, it's a node called a panner node, and that just actually adds animation to this texture coordinate. It just pushes it along in a certain direction. So with this, you just type in panner, so P-A-N-N, like that, and you should be able to find the panner node like this. I'm going to move this over here a little bit, click and drag over here, and if I right click in here, I can kind of move around, middle mouse drag up and down to kind of zoom in and out. So now I can plug the texture coordinate into the coordinate for the panner, like that, and I need to click the out of this into the UVs. Now if I click on this node, you can see over here there's some settings for some things like speed. So I can put that at a speed of 1. Let me pipe that back into the emissive color, and you can see it's going to have this thing rotate pretty quick here. We could also do -1, and it's going to send it in the other direction, -0.2, and you can see we're starting to slow that thing down, -0.01, and we got some just nice kind of rolling on there. We could also go vertical with this thing as well, but you know, that's more of a psychedelic effect, so if you're looking for something like that, you might want to use it, but I'll just set that to 0, and so we've just got this kind of movement going around in this direction. So this is what was created for the very simple material that you see in here. I'm going to just close out of this and not save any of these changes. And then once that material was made, it was just a matter of selecting that and assigning it to the Skydome. So this is probably the most simplest example that we'll take a look at. And again, it really kind of depends on what your texture is that you're going to be using for this thing. So if you have a more realistic texture, then you're going to get this more realistic looking sky that you have here. For mine, what I used was this texture that you see here, and it's actually in a square format. If I hold down Alt and click on it, you can see the size of this is 2048 by 2048. Now if you find some different textures for a Skydome, you're probably going to find aspect ratios that are quite a bit different, where it might be something that's twice as long as it is high. The size will probably be something like 4096 by 2048. Alright, now that we have our mesh and our materials set up, let's take a look at adding exponential height fog. So if you go to the visual effects area, you can find the atmospheric fog and also the exponential height fog. So you just click and drag this into the world, and it'll give you this node that you'll see here, and I'm going to turn it on. This is after going through and changing some of the settings on here. So what I'm hoping to do is hide this whole we're using this sphere and duplicating the bottom part. So this fog creates this gradient that's really thick and then kind of bleeds up and through here depending on some of the settings that you have on here. You can also do things like change the color of the fog, so you're able to make it a color if you want. I was pushing it just towards a pure white like this. You have this height fall off for the fog, so you can make it go up quite a bit if you want. So let's just see what the default value was 0.2, and I thought that was really high for what the effect that I was kind of going for on there. So I'm just going to set this back to 1.333, something right around in there. And again, if I move my camera pretty far up like this, I'm starting to see some of the clouds poke through like this here, but I'm not too concerned about it because I'm going to keep my camera pretty much right down in this area. So that works pretty good. So this directional in scattering, they also have this, I believe that's kind of the area with the sun where it's facing. It adds a little bit of colorization to this back here, so I think you can see that it's kind of tinting that a little bit based off of the direction of the directional light in here. And so that's the simple setup with the exponential height fog, and that should at least get you going with a very basic setup. So for this next example, we're going to be considering this one a medium complexity. So some of the qualities of this is going to be exactly the same as what we had before. We're going to have our sky dome. The clouds are going to be moving in this kind of circular motion to it. But at this point, we're going to be adding a sun disk to this, and we're actually going to have the clouds draw in front of that sun disk. So the material is obviously going to get a little bit more complicated. But where the complication really comes into play is that if we want this sun disk to update based off of the position of the world light, we're going to have to build a blueprint for it. So let's go ahead and take a look first at the material that was created. So I'm just going to go ahead and double click on the material that was created for this, and we'll take a look at it. And you can see within here, I actually taken the Skydome and plugged it into this little area here so we could actually see the material as if we're looking directly at the Skydome itself in the world. And so I had to kind of rotate things around to kind of find the sun in here. But here's the different components that we're taking a look at. So everything that we saw in the earlier, more simple version is kind of contained within this thing here. So the change that we have here within the material is that we're actually using parameters to control things. So what this allows you to do is take a certain value, like what we have for the panner speed, and actually dynamically change that and see that update directly in the world. So just real quickly, I'll show you an example of kind of what that looks like. In order for this setup to work, you need to make a parent material like what we looked at in the last material that we made, and then you need to make a material instance. So if you just right click over the material, you can say create material instance. This makes a special copy of the material that gives you controls over certain areas that you expose. So because I've given this panner speed, it's just a value, and I've given it this ability to be seen as a parameter. When I go to this material instance, you can see that this is way different than the material editor that we're used to looking at. It just has this certain things that were exposed by whoever made the shader to whoever's using it inside the world that you see here. So I've got this setting here for panner speed multiply, and if I change that value, you can see that I can actually up this, and it's going to start updating right there in the world very quickly, and it's more interactive that way. So I've given controls on here to update the light direction. That's pretty important for what we're going to be doing, because we need to have that sun disk that's in the world update based upon the directional light in the world. We also have this ability to change the actual color of the sun, the radius of the sun brightness, which is going to be if we are overdriving this value, how much it's going to kind of glow. And then I've given this ability to maybe tint the colors of the clouds and things like that. So I'll go ahead and take this and set this back down to 10 for the speed for this thing, and go ahead and save that. But this is basically this concept we're talking about of taking these values and parameterizing them so they can be changed interactively like this. So what we looked at before was we just had the panner node, and we were actually setting the speed directly within here for this. So if we want to change this into some kind of way that we can do this interactive part, we have to do this kind of setup that you see here. So there is this slot for time, and we can actually find a time node. We can just right click in here and then type time, and you can see you can drag that node out and get that part. And then I need a value that can change. So if you hold down 1 and click in here, you can get this constant value of 1 value. If you hold down 2, you can get 2 values. If you hold down 3 and click, you can get 3 values. And if you hold down 4, you can get something that's 4 values, like red, green, blue, and then something like alpha. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete these real quick. And any of these values, you can take it and right click over it and say convert to parameter. And so here's where you can give it a name. So you can give this parameter whatever name you wanted, and I wanted to call this panner speed multiply, and then you give it a default value that goes in here. So that was given a default value of this 10 that you see here. And then I just took a multiply node, just right click and say MUL and find the multiply like that. I think you can also hold down M and just click, and then you can get the multiply. And so the time node is being multiplied by whatever this value is that we've got here, and then that's fed into the time for this panner. And so that will cause it to actually rotate within here. So if we put this, let's just do the speed X like this, and we'll set it at 1. And you can see how this changes this math within here. Now if I take the panner speed multiply and I just set that to 1, we can still see it's pretty high. We can take this and put it at 0.5, 0.25, I'll do 0.1, something like that. We can even give it negative values like this. And so what we're doing at that point is, making this value interactive. Not so much within here in the shader, but we are making it interactive as far as what we can do with the material instance outside of the world. So I think if I just do some kind of value like this, that's pretty good. And I can actually save that. So you saw that I actually changed the setup of this. And if I hit save for the material, whatever changes I make in the parent material gets pushed down to the material instance. So now we've got this default value that I had set at 10 before. I'll just go ahead and reset that. And we've got this set at 0.05 now. So it's kind of a cool setup that whatever you do in the parent material and you have material instances, if you add parts to that thing, it gets pushed down to the children as well. And you might have to go through, like you saw, and I had to go and change that default value, and just because I changed some of the math on there. But that actually, those changes actually update within the world as well. So you can see now we've got this thing that's kind of going crazy in the world. Let's just go ahead and take the material instance of this, and I'll take this and do 0.01, something like that. And now I'll do the 0.5. I did notice on here it doesn't necessarily always take these values unless you maybe type in a value and then hit enter. So you might have to do that in here and just actually type the value, and then you can see it kind of change. And that's still going kind of fast, so maybe I'll do something like that. So I'll go ahead and hit save for that. So that's kind of some of the bigger changes that we're seeing within how this structure is set up. So you remember this was all fed into the UVs, and that's what's causing this movement. Another kind of cool thing about the material editor is that if we just want to see a certain section, we can right click over this node here and say start previewing node. And so it interrupts everything else that's being fed into the end of the material, and we get to just see this portion. So right now you're seeing purely what's being driven with the panner speed and that texture before we go to the next part that we're looking at. And then something like on here, you can see the out of this is being run to this multiply. And so if I go to this node and say start previewing node, we should see a difference in the color. You see how it got a little bit darker. That's because we're using a multiply node, and instead of multiplying by just some value, we're taking the texture that we have and then multiplying it by a color. So what was done for this one is, again, if you hold down 4 or 3, you can tap that in the world like this, and you can just double click on here and you can actually get a color like this. And so let me go here again and let me raise this thing up for the value so we can actually get that color to show. So then this is piped into the slot A of the multiply node, and then the texture is piped into B here. So again, we can take this thing, right click over it, say convert to parameter, and then we can give it a name. So that's what was done with this here. This was actually given this name called Tint Color Map Darker, and now whenever I do the material instance and we go to interactively do some changes to that, you'll see that actually show up, and then you'll be able to interactively change those values from what you're seeing there. Just something else about the multiply node real quick. If we hold down M and just tap on there, if you fed something into the A slot of this, you don't even need something in the B slot. They do have this ability for you to click on the multiply node and then just change the value directly in there without having to have something being run in there. The only time that you do need to have a value that would go in here is if we wanted to take a value and then parameterize that and then have that being, dynamically driven. At that point, you do want some kind of node going in there. But if the only functionality that you're looking for is just the multiply with just some straight value, you can just go ahead and create it like that as well. So this part, let's start talking about the sun. So again, this was just taken straight off of the blueprint and the material that was created by Epic. And so what they're doing here is they've got this node that's just a value like what we've been looking at, and it's been parameterized, so then that way it can be dynamically driven, just like what we looked at in the upper part up here. This time they've got this node called camera vector, and then they're doing a normalize of this direction of the light. So they normalize the direction of the light, they take the vector of the camera, and then they do a dot product of the two, and then that gets fed out into this sphere mask. So this is basically giving the location. Let's try to find the sun. Actually, we need to look at this part of the material. I'll just start previewing this node. I guess this is something I should tell you. If you start previewing a node, you can see it tells you up here that it's previewing, and you had to kind of find where it's previewing at, and it'll be nice and kind of blue like that, and you can tell it to stop previewing, and then you can tell it to start back up again. So now we're just looking at just the sun part, and so this this direction is actually giving the location of this sphere mask. So this is another special node that they have in here, so you can type in sphere and you can find the sphere mask. And then on this one, it's got this direction for this thing. It also has a radius. They didn't do anything with the hardness of this, but what they are doing on here, you can see that this is basically, let's see if we can start previewing this, and it will show this up. This is basically making this this sphere that you see here for this part right here. This is the part that's going to actually start making the color for this, so it's pretty crazy and pretty bright. But whenever they multiply this thing over the top of this really super brightness, you get this here, because we have something that is black and it's white in here. So if you multiply this thing over the top of this color, all the black knocks out this entire area and only lets it shine through right here in the white. Because this value is being driven, it's actually being overdriven. So you can see we've got a color here that's just kind of this yellowish kind of color, and then this thing is being multiplied by a value that's been parameterized, and it's set to 100. So 1 would be this, just the straight up color of this. Since it's being multiplied by 100, it takes that value and multiplies it 100 times there and really overdrives the thing. And so this black and white mask that you see here, in conjunction with the color that's being overdriven, is going to give you this super intense kind of glowing sun that we see here. So we already kind of know what's going on with the texture and the background here and this being able to be multiplied by a darker color. This part here, an add node, so you can just hold down A and click and that'll give you the add node, or you can right click in here and find this in here. An add node is different than the multiply. The multiply darkens something. If you do the add, you can actually start to lighten something. So we're taking the result of this background and the result of this sun, and then we're adding them together. And so it gives this right here. Okay, so this is starting to look pretty cool, starting to look pretty good. The only thing is, because we're doing an add, these clouds, it's adding the sun over the top of these clouds, so it doesn't have the appearance that the clouds are actually in front of the sun. It just feels as if maybe the cloud is so intense that it just burns right through, or it's actually sitting in front. And so that's not what we want. We want the clouds to feel as if they're sitting in front of the sun. So how this happens is through a linear interpolation node. So it's just, it looks like a lerp here, and it's kind of hard to find. You can't just type in lerp like this and find it. Actually, I didn't think you could, but it looks like you can. So let's just go ahead and do this here for linear interpolation node, or you can tap L and just click it and make it pretty easily. So this node's actually pretty cool. It gives you two different slots, an A and a B slot, and the A sits over the top of the B slot, and then it gives you this part for alpha, to where you can actually blend this A over the top of the B part here. And so what I did was I took the results of the clouds and the sun being added together and put that at the bottom, and then I want the clouds to draw over the top of this thing here. So if we just start previewing this here, we can see what's happening. So the color of the clouds is being run out. We've already kind of looked at this part. What we didn't look at is that there's actually an alpha map that is associated with this texture that we made. So I'm going to go show you over inside of Photoshop. Let's take a look at this map that we have here. And I'll kind of zoom in on here a little bit. And so what I've got here is the color, and then on the channels we've added an alpha channel, which is a black and white map. So you can see with these values, anything that's pure black is going to knock out the sun. If it's a little bit mid-gray, it'll let the sun kind of bleed through a little bit. And if it's white, it's going to let the sun come through 100%. So that's the mask for this thing. We have to save that out as a target file and then make sure we enable 32-bit to where it saves that alpha channel with this thing. So I'm going to go back here to the material. So that's where this alpha channel is being fed into this alpha slot right here for the linear interpolation. So again, this allows this combination of the background with the sun to go into slot B, and then just the clouds are fed into slot A. Actually, the whole entire image is fed into slot A, and then that alpha knocks out the parts of the background of this image and puts the clouds over the top of this. And the result of everything is fed into this emissive color. So I'm going to just tell it to stop previewing this right now. And this is basically the setup for the material. Now, one thing that's really important is that we have actually made a parent material and a material instance for this thing, because if we want the light to dynamically update the location of this sphere mask, we have to have this light direction node created, and it has to be parameterized for this thing. So I'll just go ahead and save this and close it up and close this part. So that's everything about the material on here. Let's start taking a look at the whole blueprint for this. So over in this area I made an actual folder for myself for the different blueprints that I made, and within here is the medium complexity blueprint. If you want to make a new blueprint and follow along with this, you can just right click and then say blueprint class, and I'm going to use an actor class for the blueprint on this. I'm going to go ahead and open up this medium complexity blueprint, and we can start looking at all the different components for it. And I'll take the new blueprint that we have, and then try to put it at the bottom so we can look at them both at the same time. So I'm going to open up this new blueprint that we have, click and drag it out like this, and then try to take this window and scale it up a little bit within here. So the first thing that you'll kind of want to know about is this thing called the viewport. And if we go to the viewport for this blueprint that we have, I can scroll and zoom in on here a little bit, and we can see this first part. So what I have on here is the actual Skydome was added to this area within here. So if I move this over just a little bit, we can get to the different meshes for this, and I could just click and then drag this onto the scene route that you saw here. And so this is going to have the new Skydome in here like this, but we need to override the material that is set within here. We need to have our dynamic material that we created. So I'm going to go to the materials, and then we can go to that material instance that we made that we created right here. So this needs to be plugged in. Let me open this up just a little bit more so you can see this. I'm going to select that material and then have it piped into this slot here, and immediately you saw the change that we had on here because this material has that blue tinting that we added to it on there. If I take a look around, it does have a sun within here. That's because there's a sun in the material, and there's already some default values set for where the location of that sun is. So everything that we're doing is going to be getting it to the point where it dynamically drives that position of that sun. Okay, so that's going to set up our first part for this thing. The other part is that we'll talk about is the construction script. And you can see within the construction script what we need here is actually setting up dynamic material instance. And with the dynamic material instance, what is really going to happen is we get to feed it the piece of geometry that we're looking for. So we can take this Skydome and click and drag out like this, and that's going to actually be the thing that's going to be driven for the material. And it also looks for what material is on here if there's an instance. So if we do dynamic, create, just start typing in dynamic, and we can create this dynamic material instance like we see here. So the construction script has to fire off into this pin here. This is our target that we have, and then we need to tell it what source material, what material do we want to have this thing change right here. So let's drag this thing over again and select our material instance that we have, and then just pipe it right into here like that. So this is telling it that we're going to be changing that material dynamically. The next thing we're going to do is make a new variable for ourselves. So we can go to this add new right here and say variable, and then we're going to actually make this into a material instance. So you might not see this here. You might see something like a boolean, and you can just click right here and you can start typing in material, and you want to find a material instance and change it to this type here, and then you can give it a variable name. So what I did for the part up here was call it SkyTune material instance. So I can just call this Sky Mat inst, something like that, and hit enter. And then this is going to show up in this area. We can click and drag this thing out, and we want to go ahead and set this. So this is going to give us this node that you see here, and we'll just pipe in everything from here to here. And then let's move this over into this area a little bit here, right here like this. So this part right here is actually going to set the value for that parameter that we're defining within the material. So we're calling it light direction here. We're going to click and drag off of here, and if we start typing in vector for vector and then param, we can see that we've got this set vector parameter value, but if I have context sensitivity on, it doesn't let me see another option that there is. So I'll turn that off, and you can see the one that I want is not this Kismet material library. The one I want is this target is material instance dynamic. So I'll click that, and this gets this set up here for us. One thing that I didn't do with this variable that we set before, there is a material instance, but there's also a material instance dynamic. So I'm going to change that variable type to material instance dynamic, and then it'll allow me to pipe into this target. If I didn't do that, it would give me an error and say that I couldn't change that thing. So this parameter name is actually pretty important. So if you're not good at typing, like I'm not, what you could do is open up the actual material for this and then just go to the actual name of that thing that we're looking for. And I can take the name here and then copy that and then paste that directly into the parameter name. And then that way I know that for sure I have everything kind of hooked up the way that it needs to be hooked up, and it's going to actually work. So the other thing that we're doing is that we're going to set this actual value that we see in here. So basically what we're doing, we're taking the directional light in the world, and we're getting the actor rotation, and then we're getting the rotation X vector, and then we're piping that into this value in here. Now something that we need for this directional light is something that we can kind of plug in here for whatever direction light that we put within the world. So we actually need a new variable type like this, and we can come over here and start looking in here, and we're going to type in directional light and then find the directional light variable within here. We can give it a name, and so I'll just call it directional light. Like that, and then we can go ahead and click and drag this into here and get this right here like that. Then we need the to get the actor rotation. Like this. So we get the actor rotation, and then we need to get the rotation X vector. Get rotation X vector like this, and then if we click and drag out, this is a different variable type, but it should automatically make this connection for us like what we see here. And so this, let me go ahead and grab this part and just rearrange it a little bit better, and we can see that we've got everything kind of set up the way that we have for this construction script. So this part is going to set up the dynamic changing of the material. Now let's start taking a look at a new function type that we have to create. And you can see within here, this is just to give us that control that we can have within the blueprint in the editor, just to update things. If you saw earlier, we have to actually move the light and then click a little button to actually set the direction for this. So this part is exactly the same as what we made before. We do have to make a new function though, so just made a new function like this and then called it update sun direction like that, and then we've got this area for this new part here. We can take the construction script, and you can see everything is pretty much the same for this thing up to this point right in here. We don't need this set, this, and this thing here, so we just copy that and then go update here and then paste this portion in. And so this part here is let's just move this thing down just a little bit. We're going to have a branching condition, so we can just type in branch like this, and it's going to give us this thing where if we have a condition, no matter if it's true or false, because we just want to click the button and have it update this thing. We don't care if the condition is really true or false on there. So we've made another variable type called refresh sun location, and so we can just go and make another variable right in through here like this. This time we'll just do a boolean for this, so that's going to be an on or off kind of thing, and let's call this refresh sun direction, like that. And then we can click and drag this thing out, and we'll go ahead and get this and then pipe that part in, and that will go ahead up and set up this function that we have for the updating the sun direction that we have in here. And so then the next part is going to the event graph that we have. If we come here, then basically what we need to do is we want to update that tune direction, like what I've got here. So let's look at this function here, and basically we're going to take this update sun direction that we created and click and drag out here, and then do this event play, and then pipe that in. And then we need to compile everything and then go ahead and save it. So once everything's set up, I'm going to go ahead and take this new blueprint that I made and click and drag it into the world. You can see it's going to put our Skydome in here. I'm going to go ahead and say 0, 0, 0 for the location of everything, and then just give it a uniform scale of 10 right now for something like that. And you can see the direction, the sun is not actually set with the light direction that we see here. So it should be higher up into the air. One thing that we need to do is make sure that we plug in the directional light that we have. If you remember that variable type that we made with the directional light, this basically exposes this thing here, so we can pipe in whatever the directional light is for the world. So you can see that here, if we click and drag this arrow, we can find the directional light, and so we'll just go ahead and pick this directional light for this scene that we're in, and it automatically pops into place. One thing that we want to do is this. If I take the light and I change the position of it, we need this to update, but we didn't enable something on the blueprint to make sure that we can just click this and update this, and I'll show you what that is. So if we just double click on the blueprint here, if we check our refresh sun direction variable that we set, that was in the function that you see here, we're going to go ahead and tell it to be editable. I'll go ahead and compile and then save and then close this down. We'll select the blueprint now, and you'll notice that there's now a refresh sun direction that we can click and go ahead and enable that for us. So I'm going to go ahead and take this here and then move it just to a different location, just so we can see this update through here. And then we'll click it again, and you can see now the sun is going to update based off of the rotation of the light that we have here, like that. So this is the conclusion of the medium complexity. Now we'll start looking at even more difficult complexity with this setup that we have here.